think a lot of you that are fans of the alternative media probably have come across Ben Swann, who was originally a local news reporter who did a lot of, I would say, very good reporting for a while concerning, alternative media topics. He, of course, some of them I can't even talk about because of YouTube censorship. He's been a steady defender of civil liberties. He even criticized the Kavanaugh nomination with one of the best interpretations of why he would be a poor choice from a libertarian standpoint, as opposed to a lot of the smears that were used against Kavanaugh. So I have definitely a lot of admiration for some of the past work he's done, but I don't think that Ben Swann's above reproach. I think in some cases he buys into innuendo, if I can call it that. I don't like to call things that are unconfirmed conspiracy theories, but I do like to call them unproven, and just in some cases they are innuendo. They're things that are suggested by other signs that are above the surface, but when you drill down below, it's not necessarily true the way it's portrayed by people like Ben Swann. So it's not with the great joy that I want to do this video, and I actually waited way too late to do it, and I should have probably done it earlier during the day today. But he did a video. He's now working with RT on the changes going on in Venezuela.
Venezuela hasn't really made very many headlines lately, and certainly talk of overthrowing the country's president, Nicolas Maduro, that's been relatively quiet. That is until this week, when the U.S.-backed legitimate, I'm doing air quotes, you can't see me, president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, he suddenly popped up at the State of the Union on Tuesday, then spent the day with President Trump on Wednesday at the White House.
All Americans are united with the Venezuelan people in their righteous struggle for freedom. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
So it seems that the effort to remove Maduro from power is back on. But over the past few months, something fascinating has been taking place in Venezuela. Instead of continuing to push forward with policies as usual, the Maduro regime has reportedly shifted to opening the country up to outside investment and more of a capitalist system. According to the New York Times, quote, shopping malls that were deserted just 6 months ago are bustling, and imported SUVs course through the streets. New restaurants and bars are popping up weekly in the wealthier parts of town. Their tables packed with foreign businessmen, fashionable locals, and government insiders. In his speeches, Maduro is still promoting a vision of Venezuela in which all of its resources are shared by all. But according to Venezuelan economist Ramiro Molina, the gap between rhetoric and reality is greater than ever. The fight for survival has forced the government to become more pragmatic. Quote, only the narrative is still socialist. Again, according to the Times, the government has slashed red tape and turned a blind eye to taxation, fueling a boom in private exports of everything from oil to chocolate, enriching the politically connected and traditional business elites. Joining us now to discuss is the host of The News with Rick Sanchez, and RT producer, Dr. Enrique Rivera, who has a PhD in Latin American history with a focus on political economies and Venezuela. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Enrique.
So I don't know if we'll get back to the show, but notice what he did not mention. Actually, I think this was published the day after, so it's not his fault, but it's beyond just allowing people to avoid taxes and to attract private investment. The New York Times on February 8th said that to survive, Venezuela's leader gives up decades of control over oil. Faced with a severe economic crisis, the country's leader, Nicolas Maduro, is letting foreign firms take over daily operations of its oil fields. It's a break with core tenets of his socialist revolution. And this is a consequence of several years of both mismanagement of PDVSA and the general Venezuelan economy and the oil industry and the energy industry and the energy sector over there. But also, you could throw in the recent U.S. sanctions that started in 2017 with the Trump administration's entry into power. And it's certainly broken Venezuela and put them over a barrel, if you pardon the pun. So And along with that, on January 27th, this is from S&P Global Platts, which is one of the leading trade journals online for the oil industry. They said that PDVSA shuts its last two operating refineries in Venezuela on Y and Cardone. And these two, think about what that means. Venezuela is basically only able to export literally crude oil. They cannot export any sort of refined oil. In fact, Venezuela has been losing money on its oil industry in many ways because it has to import lighter grades of petroleum in order to balance the heavy crude that they are able to extract from their own reserves. So yes, people seem to think, well, Venezuela, they're trying to take it over, do regime change in order to exploit the massive oil reserves under its soil. But it's not quite as simple, because even with the titanic reserves of oil within Venezuela, first of all, you need to improve the infrastructure, and second of all, you would still need to blend the heavy Venezuelan crude with lighter crudes from the Gulf and other parts of the world. And in fact, it could be of better use for Russia, which is a major petroleum producer, to not have Venezuela export oil, because it would create, I guess, a surplus on the market. The oil is, people like to think that the oil industry is some sort of diabolical network that creates all of the wars around the world. And yes, there have been some wars, the Iraq War in particular, that at certain junctures, I would say, were motivated by oil. The Persian Gulf War, as well as the Iran-Iraq War, both of them prior to the Iraq War, those were both related to oil. And even some of the wars in the Caucasus on Russia's doorstep are motivated by oil pipelines and oil fields. So we're not talking about something that's unrelated to war, but because of the abundance of petroleum across the world now, due in part to liberalization of the laws concerning exploration and later drilling, we're not at a point where companies necessarily have to find new oil reserves in order to remain profitable and for the world economy to find new oil reserves in order to continue to run. Fuel efficiency standards have improved somewhat. The electrical car market is growing. It's not. I don't think it will ever completely replace the combustion engine. I don't know if I could say ever, but it's going to be a while. It's not a transition that's going to happen overnight, and there's certainly issues with electric cars. But PDVSA being privatized is essentially the nail in the coffin of the socialist dream in Latin America, or at least in Venezuela. You have to remember that when he took power in 1998, Hugo Chavez was continuously trying to make it seem like he was protecting the assets of every Venezuelan, and later by extension every Latin American, from the greedy hands of globalist capitalism and Yankee imperialists. And now his successor, Maduro, who is supposedly the guardian of this, or the custodian of this socialist revolution, Bolivarian socialism of the 21st century, is betraying that very vision, according to many of the followers of this stream of thought. And it's not surprising. The fact is that they don't have what to make do with day to day. It says here, so private companies are pumping crude, arranging exports, paying workers, buying equipment, and even hiring security guards to protect their operations in a collapsing countryside, according to managers and oil consultants working on the country's energy projects. In effect, a stealth privatization is taking place, said Rafael Ramirez, who ran Venezuela's oil company for more than a decade before speaking with Mr. Maduro in 2017 in a video address this week. Today, PDVSA doesn't manage our oil industry. Venezuelans don't manage it. So this is a guy who left Venezuela in 2017. He's saying today PDVSA doesn't manage our oil industry. Venezuelans don't manage it. In the middle of the chaos generated by the worst economic crisis suffered by the country in its history, Maduro is taking actions to cede, transfer, and hand over oil operations to private capital. PDVSA did not respond to requests for comment on its recent concessions to private partners. The haphazard changes to the oil sector, which have accelerated in recent months, are remaking the oil industry in a nation whose assertive energy policies had, since the 1950s, served as an example to developing countries of how to take control of natural resources. And they are a stark retreat from the vision of Hugo Chavez, who was Mr. Maduro's mentor and predecessor. Mr. Chavez nationalized in 2007 the giant holdings of ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips and packed PDVSA's leadership ranks with political allies dedicated to his socialist-inspired Bolivarian revolution. But Mr. Maduro's transformation of Venezuela's oil industry has stemmed the collapse triggered by an American embargo. Sanctions imposed in January 2019 had wiped out about a third of Venezuela's oil production, bringing it down at one point to the lowest level since the 1940s, according to the data from OPEC. Oil production now is still less than a third of the total in 1998 when Mr. Chavez took power. By late 2019, Venezuela had stabilized exports at about 1 million barrels per day, according to Bloomberg's tanker tracking data. The dribble of oil exports has provided Mr. Maduro with foreign revenue at the most critical moment of the country's economic crisis, allowing him to adjust the sanctions and consolidate his rule. So this is where I think we'll try to. So it says the unofficial partial privatizations of the past year have been led by an unlikely reformer, Manuel Quevedo, a National Guard general with no known oil experience, who was appointed by Mr. Maduro to head PDVSA. General Quevedo broke with the nationalist rhetoric of his predecessors to hand over operational control of joint oil projects to partners that included Chevron, Russia's state-run oil company Rosneft, some European and Chinese companies, and groups of Venezuelan magnates. So in order to save the socialist leadership of Venezuela is giving up socialism. And this is where I'll pick up the video a little bit.
Okay, I want to actually start with you here because this report, first of all, it's coming out of the New York Times, so we already have to preface it with that. Right. But it's talking about the fact.
So remember here, they haven't even mentioned, and I'm far be it for me to take the side of the New York Times, but Ben Swann isn't even mentioning something that maybe he knows about, even though this came out a day before the New York Times article, but presumably RT would be able to know because they have a little better of a communication within Venezuela with what's going on over there. They don't have the same boundaries as the New York Times. RT and Russian media is a little bit more friendly with Venezuela than American media. He doesn't mention anything about the oil industry. The Platts report came out on January 27th. So he would have ample time to find out about that.
The fact that in rural areas, we're certainly still seeing a lot of poverty, lack of water, basic resources. But in the city of Caracas specifically, there is this kind of surge that's happening here. Is there a gap reforming between super wealthy, kind of capitalist people in the cities and the poor people who are the socialists in the rural communities? What's true and what's not?
Well, as you said, this is the New York Times. Right. And so there's a great deal of misinformation going on around regarding Venezuela.
Sure.
And the economy is no different. Just real quick, I mean, as far as the water is concerned, I mean, that problem really surfaced last March when Venezuela's electrical grid was hacked. And soon after, Guaido had declared himself president.
So they're proceeding with this claim that was put forward by the Maduro government that their electrical grid was hacked by the CIA and therefore Venezuela's electricity went out. But it's first of all, that wasn't the first time that there were massive blackouts across Venezuela, and it wasn't the last time. So suddenly people are trying to make this case that, and they give these excuses all the time about how their leadership is not really responsible for the mistakes. It's really some sort of foreign intervention, the sanctions, CIA hacking, subversion by the CIA and everything. Look, I am not an apologist for the CIA, but for them to claim that Venezuela's decrepit and declining energy infrastructure is the fault of the CIA is dishonest journalism. It's just a fact. And Ben Swann should know better.
And that's where you had that water crisis.
Right.
But thankfully, that has been largely resolved. As far as your question, I mean, we are given the impression that Venezuela is kind of like Soviet Russia before the reforms of the 80s.
You're like heavily communist as opposed to socialist.
Completely government-run economy. China before the 70s, et cetera. But the reality is that private enterprise and capital investments have played a huge, important, and critical role in the history of Venezuela under Chavez and under Maduro. And so the reforms that are being implemented by Maduro are, yes, pragmatic, but they're not that huge as the New York Times is reporting. I think the real story here is that Venezuela's economy is slowly getting back on track. There's the impression from investors that the worst of this economic depression really is over, and that Venezuela is back in business as it was 5 years ago.
And I think I think Venezuela stands, guys, as a test case for U.S. hegemony. And I really believe, as strong as this country of ours is, in its ability to convince the world you got to go our way or it's the highway,
Sure.
that somehow this particular administration has created even as much as we've seen before, where countries look at the United States and say, you know, that's not kosher. That doesn't seem fair. So when a guy like Maduro goes to the EU or goes around the world, obviously Russia and China are on the side of Maduro, and puts his hand out and says, I'm a poor victim. Look what the United States is doing to me. He's more apt to be able to get more cash flow, actually even some subsidies that are helping his economy, whereas he wouldn't have if the United States weren't beating him up. So this intervention on the part of the
So this is another dishonest argument from Rick Sanchez, formerly of CNN, who also works for RT now, which says that the Chinese and Russians would have had no interest in bailing out Maduro if the United States hadn't been as adversarial to him. That ignores the reality of what's called realpolitik. Realpolitik, which was coined during the Cold War, with regards to how the U.S. and the Soviet Union balanced their ideological conflict with the reality that they needed to negotiate, means that countries do navigate within the needs and interests that they have, despite, in many cases, some of their ideological beliefs. So you have countries like China. China is probably the greatest example of realpolitik in recent history, where publicly they claim to be a Marxist, people's democracy in the tradition of Mao Zedong, when in reality the economy has departed drastically from the way it was under Mao. You have, in many cases, private multinational corporations opening up gigantic factories across China, and the pollution of some of these areas is just it's clearly taken its toll, and now you have health crises. Is it related to it? I wouldn't say, but there's other aspects of the way China runs itself that lend themselves to these outbreaks of pandemics. So yes, I would say that the way they're trying to spin it in this video is truly some sort of, it's the same idea as you see and I can't cut it here because I don't have time, but if you've ever seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, the case of the Black Knight, where you chop the arm off and he's saying, oh, it's just a flesh wound. It's the same idea. They're trying to deny that there is any sort of concession or loss, when in reality, by abandoning socialism, by abandoning PDVSA, which was incorporated in 1976, it was the nationalization of the entire petroleum industry in Venezuela. And it was basically done by Carlos Andres Perez, who was the previous president of Venezuela several years before Chavez came to power, and who's now considered a villain. Now, what Venezuela is doing, not only are they abandoning, in many cases, the ideas of socialism, they are also going beyond privatizing to the degree that was well before Chavez. So yes, this would be a betrayal. This was something. This is going well beyond the 1998 Chavez revolution. Is the Bolivarian revolution. It's going all the way back to 1976.
The United States, I believe, is backfiring just as it did in Cuba for 40 years.
And Rick, I wanted to go to kind of a media perspective on this. I mean, you've been...
So that, again, that's a deceptive statement. He said, sorry to cut them off, but Rick Sanchez says that, this is backfiring the same way it did with Cuba. No, Cuba has never abandoned the state model of control of almost any industry. What they've done is they've allowed foreign tourism to be a source of revenue, and therefore they've created a parallel economy for tourists and for the domestic Cuban people. What's happening in Cuba is much, much more of a deep departure. So he's trying to say, well, we shot ourselves in the foot with Cuba. We're doing the same thing with Venezuela. It's the contrary, because why would the United States care if Venezuela is abandoning communism? That's the whole goal. We don't want them, those of us that believe in capitalism, we don't want them to be practicing socialism in any form. And the more that they betray their quote-unquote socialist ideals, the less there is to object about them. Obviously, there's other issues with them beyond socialism, such as their surveillance state and the way that they treat people and their workers, and the way they treat dissidents, things like that. But the main problem with Venezuela, with respect to the United States, is their encouragement of socialism throughout the Western Hemisphere.
Been doing this for, I don't want to insult you, 40 years.
Go
maybe.
ahead.
But we see...
Everybody knows I'm old.
We see a bipartisan group of lawmakers making this kind of same push for Guaido versus Maduro.
Right.
We see most of the mainstream media, I mean, as Ben mentioned, this is a New York Times story,
Sure.
so don't take that away from it. But is that narrative to do exactly what Enrique said, to keep it as a socialist, communist bad, everybody, capitalist society good?
So, that's an interesting theory. What you're basically saying is that deep down, the United States doesn't want the problem to go away because the problem in and of itself helps them get elected. Mm-hmm. Something Bill Clinton found out when he was one of the last Democrats who was able to get votes in South Florida. And he actually won Miami-Dade County. Mm-hmm. But ever since Reagan, right, the vote in Florida has gone Republican. Part of it was because of the Reagan mystique. But then along came a little boy named Elian Gonzalez.
That's right.
And that changed everything.
That was during the Clinton years.
And since then, Florida votes Republican and has continued to vote Republican. And this is smart, politically speaking, on the part of the Trump administration, to have Guaido there to tell the people in South Florida, look, we're looking out for you.
Right.
Do they really care about changing Venezuela? Probably not. But having Guaido there gets them votes and gets Republicans elected.
But there is a failure that's...
So now this is interesting. So Rick Sanchez is saying that whereas the Chinese and the Russians are actually trying to help Venezuela through their loans and their investment and in many cases their military support, for whatever reason, the U.S. support for the Venezuelan opposition is entirely based on politics, is entirely based on earning the votes of Cuban and Venezuelan exiles. So this is how you tell that there's an ideological bias. Not that there's a problem with that. Obviously, RT, owned by Russia, they can have their opinions. In some cases, their opinions are less ridiculous than those in the mainstream media. But you have to take it with a grain of salt as well, because Venezuela's government has basically thrown in the towel on its central idea of the past 22 years. The idea that the state can manage the economy better than the private sector. This is something that it effectively signals the end of the era of Bolivarian socialism. And now, from now on, if Maduro continues on this track, it's not going to matter what sort of stupid logo that he shows or what his party proposes officially, because the policy has changed and society is going to respond to that. So that's about it. Please like, share, and subscribe. Also subscribe to me on BitChute and on Subscribestar, as well as on Minds.com. You can contribute to me on Subscribestar if you want. All of those are with the handle at Chef Leopard or just Chef Leopard. And you can also find me on Gab at Starscream85. And have a great evening.